October 1947. A small bell chimes above the door of Thompson's Bakery in the village of Little Wickham, Hertfordshire. The familiar sound that has welcomed customers for decades now announces something unprecedented. A tall man in a faded grey uniform steps hesitantly across the threshold, his worn boots echoing on the wooden floor. The morning chatter among the local customers dies instantly, replaced by a silence so thick it seems to press against the walls. Margaret Thompson looks up from behind the counter, her hands freezing mid-motion as she wraps a loaf of fresh bread. The man before her is unmistakably German, one of the prisoners of war now working on the surrounding farms. His uniform, though clean and mended, bears the telltale marks of captivity. Yet here he stands, not behind barbed wire or flanked by guards, but alone in her shop, hat respectfully removed, blue eyes meeting hers with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Hans Müller approaches the counter slowly, acutely aware of the stares burning into his back. In careful, heavily accented English, he speaks. "Good morning, madam. May I please buy some cigarettes?" His voice is soft, deferential, carrying none of the arrogance the British public had been conditioned to expect from their former enemies. The other customers exchange bewildered glances. Mrs. Hartwell clutches her handbag tighter. Young Tommy Fletcher gapes openly, having never seen a real German soldier up close. Margaret's mind races. Her son Robert died on the beaches of Normandy just 3 years ago, cut down by machine gun fire from men who might have looked exactly like this stranger. The grief is still raw. The loss still echoes through every corner of her daily life. Yet here stands not a faceless enemy from her nightmares, but a human being, polite and patient, asking for nothing more than a simple purchase. The moment stretches like an eternity. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, Margaret reaches for a pack of cigarettes from the shelf behind her. "That'll be 1 shilling and 6pence, she says quietly. Hans fumbles for the correct coins, his hands trembling slightly as he places them on the counter. Their fingers brush briefly as she hands him the cigarettes, and in that fleeting contact, something shifts. "Thank you very much, madam," he says, his gratitude genuine and profound. As Hans turns to leave, the bell chimes again, and gradually the shop's normal rhythm resumes. But for Margaret Thompson, and perhaps for others who witnessed this simple transaction, the world has changed. The enemy has a face, a voice, and a need for cigarettes just like anyone else. This scene, playing out in villages and towns across Britain, represents one of the most remarkable social experiments in modern history. By 1946, Britain found itself the reluctant guardian of over 400,000 German prisoners of war, more than any other Allied nation. These men, captured during the final years of the conflict, presented both an enormous logistical challenge and an unprecedented opportunity. The sheer scale of the undertaking was staggering: 400,000 human beings requiring food, shelter, medical care, and meaningful occupation. To put this in perspective, this population exceeded that of many British cities, yet these were not citizens, but former enemies, men who had fought against the Crown and everything it represented. The initial response was predictable. Hastily constructed camps sprouted across the British countryside, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, patrolled by armed guards. The prisoners were housed in wooden barracks, fed basic rations, and kept under constant surveillance. Security was paramount, discipline absolute. These men had been trained killers in the service of Nazi Germany, and few Britons were inclined toward leniency. Yet as the war ended and attention turned to rebuilding, a different reality emerged. Britain was facing acute labor shortages across multiple sectors. Agriculture, already strained by years of wartime demands, desperately needed workers to maintain food production. Industry required hands to rebuild what the Blitz had destroyed. Construction projects languished for want of laborers. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men sat idle behind wire fences, consuming resources without contributing to the national recovery. The solution, when it came, was both pragmatic and revolutionary. Rather than viewing the prisoners purely as a burden to be contained, British authorities began to see them as a resource to be utilized. The Geneva Conventions provided a framework for prisoner employment, stipulating that such work must be voluntary, fairly compensated, and conducted under humane conditions. What emerged was a program that would fundamentally challenge preconceptions on both sides of the wire. The transformation began cautiously in 1945. German prisoners were organized into supervised work gangs, typically consisting of about 30 men, always under the watchful eyes of armed British guards. Their primary assignments were in agriculture, addressing the critical need for food production during a period when rationing remained in effect and every calorie counted. These early work details were strictly regimented affairs. The prisoners would be marched from their camps to designated work sites, labored under constant supervision, and returned to confinement at day's end. What surprised the British authorities was the prisoners' response to this opportunity. Far from the sullen resistance they had expected, the Germans displayed remarkable discipline and work ethic. Farmers reported that the prisoners were punctual, diligent, and eager to work. They followed instructions carefully, showed initiative in solving problems, and demonstrated skills that often exceeded those of available British workers. Many had agricultural backgrounds and brought techniques learned in Germany that proved valuable to British farming operations. Encouraged by these positive reports and driven by practical necessity, British authorities began to relax their supervision. By 1946, smaller groups of prisoners were working with minimal oversight. Guards were reduced in number and often remained at a distance, intervening only when necessary. The prisoners responded to this trust with continued good behavior, and incidents of misconduct or attempted escape remained remarkably rare. The turning point came when the government made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Prisoners would be housed directly on the farms where they worked, living alongside British families in converted barns, outbuildings, or specially constructed accommodations. This policy shift marked a fundamental change from containment to integration, from viewing the prisoners as threats to be managed to seeing them as individuals capable of contributing to British society. The integration of German prisoners into British communities was not without its challenges, particularly for those who had suffered personal losses during the war. The story of Margaret Thompson illustrates the complex emotions and difficult choices faced by ordinary Britons during this period. Margaret had run her small bakery in Little Wickham for over 20 years, serving the same families, knowing everyone's preferences, celebrating their joys and mourning their losses. Her shop was more than a business. It was a cornerstone of village life, a place where news was shared and community bonds were strengthened. When her son Robert was killed during the Normandy landings in 1944, that warm community became Margaret's lifeline. Neighbours brought casseroles and kind words. Regular customers lingered to chat, offering what comfort they could. The shop continued to operate, but the light had gone out of Margaret's world. Robert had been her only child, her pride and joy, a young man full of promise whose life was cut short by German bullets on a French beach. So when Hans Meller first entered her shop that autumn morning in 1947, Margaret faced a profound moral and emotional challenge. Here was a man who, just years before, had been part of the machine that killed her son. The uniform he wore, though now faded and patched, was the same grey that had swept across Europe, bringing death and destruction in its wake. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse service, to order him out, to protect her space from this intrusion of painful memories. Yet, as she looked into Hans's eyes, Margaret saw something that complicated her anger. She saw uncertainty, perhaps even fear. This man was far from home, dependent on the kindness of strangers who had every reason to hate him. He spoke carefully, respectfully, making no demands, asking for no special treatment. He was, she realized with uncomfortable clarity, simply another human being trying to navigate an impossible situation with whatever dignity he could muster. The decision to serve him was not a moment of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was something more basic and perhaps more profound, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the categories of friend and enemy. When Margaret handed Hans his cigarettes and accepted his payment, she was not absolving him of past actions or embracing him as a friend. She was simply acknowledging that the war was over, that life must continue, and that small acts of ordinary decency might be the foundation upon which a better future could be built. Over the following weeks, Hans became a regular customer at Thompson's bakery. Each visit was brief and businesslike, but gradually the tension eased. Margaret learned that he was 24 years old, from a farming family in Bavaria. He had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 18, captured during the final collapse of German resistance, and had spent the last 2 years in various British camps. He spoke of his family with obvious affection and worry, uncertain whether they had survived the chaos of Germany's defeat. These conversations, conducted in Hans's improving English, supplemented by gestures and the occasional German phrase that Margaret began to recognize, slowly humanized both participants. Margaret began to see Hans not as the embodiment of her loss, but as a young man caught up in events beyond his control. Hans, for his part, experienced perhaps for the first time the possibility that his former enemies might judge him as an individual rather than as a representative of a hated regime. Their evolving relationship mirrored a broader transformation occurring across Britain. As German prisoners were granted greater freedoms and integrated more fully into local communities, the rigid categories of wartime began to blur. Language barriers, initially formidable, gradually diminished as prisoners worked to improve their English, while locals picked up basic German phrases. Cultural exchanges became commonplace, with German prisoners sharing their skills in craftsmanship, woodworking, and metalwork, while learning about British customs and traditions. Churches played a particularly significant role in this integration process. Many German prisoners, being devout Christians, sought solace in attending religious services. Initially, their presence was met with skepticism and discomfort. Congregants were wary of sharing pews with former enemies, uncertain how to reconcile Christian principles of forgiveness with fresh memories of war and loss. Yet over time, shared faith proved a powerful bridge across national and cultural divides. Sunday services became exercises in practical reconciliation. Prayers were offered in both languages, hymns were sung together, and the universal themes of redemption and hope resonated regardless of accent or nationality. Pastors found themselves counseling both British parishioners struggling with forgiveness and German prisoners grappling with guilt and uncertainty about their futures. These religious communities became laboratories for post-war healing, demonstrating that spiritual bonds could transcend political divisions. Cinema outings provided another avenue for cultural connection. Local theatres began allowing prisoners to attend screenings, creating the surreal sight of British civilians and German soldiers sitting side by side, laughing at comedies or gasping at dramas. These shared experiences of entertainment highlighted commonalities rather than differences, revealing that humor, fear, and wonder were universal human responses that needed no translation. Sports, particularly football, served as a universal language that required no interpreter. Matches were organized between local teams and groups of prisoners, events that drew large crowds and generated considerable excitement. The games were competitive but friendly, with both sides displaying good sportsmanship and mutual respect. Spectators cheered for skillful plays regardless of which team executed them, and these sporting events became symbols of reconciliation and community spirit. The British government's re-education programme further facilitated this integration process. Rather than imposing democratic values through lectures or propaganda, the programme emphasised experiential learning. By living and working alongside British citizens, prisoners experienced firsthand the principles of democracy, individual rights, and the rule of law. This approach proved remarkably effective, as many prisoners began to question the ideologies they had previously accepted without scrutiny. The formation of genuine friendships between former enemies represents perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period. The relationship between Wilhelm Schneider, a German prisoner, and John Davies, a British farmer, illustrates how personal connections could transcend national animosities. Wilhelm had been captured during the final weeks of the war and assigned to work on John's farm in the Cotswolds. Their initial interactions were marked by mutual wariness and suspicion. John Davies had lost his younger brother during the Battle of Britain, shot down while defending London against German bombers. The sight of a German uniform on his property stirred painful memories and conflicted emotions. Wilhelm, for his part, was uncertain how he would be treated by a people he had been taught to view as decadent and weak. The early days of their working relationship were characterized by minimal communication and careful distance. Yet necessity demanded cooperation, and gradually barriers began to erode. John observed Wilhelm's dedication to the work, his skill with machinery, and his obvious knowledge of farming techniques. Wilhelm appreciated John's patience, his willingness to explain local methods, and his fair treatment. Slowly, professional respect evolved into something approaching friendship. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult harvest season when mechanical failures threatened to leave crops rotting in the fields. Wilhelm worked alongside John for 18 hours straight, using his mechanical expertise to keep aging equipment functioning. When the last grain was safely stored, John invited Wilhelm to join his family for dinner, a gesture that marked a fundamental shift in their relationship. Seated at the Davies family table, sharing a meal and conversation, the two men began to share their stories. Wilhelm spoke of his family's farm in Germany, the hardships they had faced during the war, and his fears for their survival in the chaos of defeat. John recounted memories of his brother, the pain of loss, and his own struggles to maintain the farm with limited help. These personal revelations created bonds of understanding that transcended their former enmity. Wilhelm became more than just a laborer. He was treated as a member of the Davies family. He attended local events with them, celebrated holidays, and even began teaching John's children basic German phrases. His presence at village gatherings initially raised eyebrows, but his quiet dignity and obvious integration into the Davies household gradually won acceptance from the broader community. Their friendship did not go unnoticed by other farmers in the area, many of whom began to reconsider their own relationships with German workers. The example set by John Davies demonstrated that former enemies could become trusted colleagues and even friends given time and mutual respect. This pattern repeated itself across rural Britain as practical cooperation evolved into personal connection. The integration of German prisoners into British society also led to the formation of romantic relationships that challenged social norms and legal restrictions. Love, it seemed, recognized no national boundaries, and despite official disapproval and social pressure, relationships developed between prisoners and British women. These romances were particularly controversial given the recent end of hostilities and the fresh memories of war's devastation. Anna Whitfield, a young woman working as a land girl on a farm near Cambridge, found herself drawn to Klaus Richter, a German prisoner assigned to the same agricultural operation. Their initial interactions were professional and distant, but working together in the fields, sharing the challenges of farm life, and facing the daily rhythms of rural existence fostered a growing connection. Anna had lost her fiancé during the war, killed in action in North Africa. The grief had left her emotionally numb, uncertain about her future, and skeptical about the possibility of happiness. Klaus, captured during the retreat from France, carried his own burden of loss and displacement. His hometown had been destroyed by Allied bombing, his family's fate unknown. Both were young people whose lives had been derailed by forces beyond their control. Their friendship developed slowly, built on shared work and quiet conversations during rest breaks. Anna was struck by Klaus's gentleness, his obvious intelligence, and his deep regret for the actions of his country. Klaus was drawn to Anna's resilience, her kindness, and the warmth she showed despite her own losses. Love grew gradually, almost imperceptibly, until both realized that their feelings had evolved far beyond friendship. However, their relationship faced significant obstacles. British law explicitly prohibited marriages between British citizens and German prisoners of war. Social pressure was intense, with many viewing such relationships as betrayals of those who had died fighting against Germany. Anna faced criticism from friends and family, while Klaus risked punishment from military authorities. Despite these challenges, their relationship deepened. They met in secret, exchanged letters, and dreamed of a future together when legal restrictions might be lifted. Their story was not unique. Across Britain, similar relationships were developing between prisoners and local women, creating a social phenomenon that authorities could not ignore. The pressure for change mounted throughout 1946 and early 1947. Humanitarian organizations argued that prohibiting marriages violated basic human rights. Military officials noted that such relationships often had a stabilizing effect on prisoners, reducing disciplinary problems and escape attempts. Local communities, witnessing these relationships firsthand, began to advocate for policy changes. In 1947, recognizing the changing social reality and the genuine nature of many relationships, the British government lifted the ban on marriages between British women and German prisoners of war. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Records indicate that 796 marriages took place shortly after the restrictions were removed, with many more following in subsequent months. Anna and Klaus were among those who chose to marry immediately after the ban was lifted. Their wedding was a modest affair, attended by close friends and family members who had come to accept their union. The ceremony represented more than just a personal commitment. It symbolized the possibility of reconciliation and the triumph of human connection over political division. The economic impact of German prisoner integration extended far beyond individual relationships and local communities. At a national level, the contribution of prisoner labor proved invaluable to Britain's post-war recovery. The country was grappling with severe labor shortages across multiple sectors, and the availability of skilled, disciplined workers helped address critical needs during a crucial period of reconstruction. Agriculture benefited most directly from prisoner labor, with many British farm workers still serving in the military or having moved to industrial jobs during the war. Rural areas faced acute labor shortages. German prisoners filled this gap, bringing not only willing hands but often considerable agricultural expertise. Many had farming backgrounds and introduced techniques and efficiencies that proved beneficial to British agricultural operations. The prisoners' contribution to food production was particularly significant given the continuation of rationing and the urgent need to increase domestic food output. Their efforts helped maintain and even increase agricultural productivity during a period when Britain was striving for greater food security and reduced dependence on imports. Farmers consistently reported that prisoner workers were reliable, skilled, and often more productive than available alternatives. Beyond agriculture, German prisoners were employed in various industries, including construction, mining, and manufacturing. Their technical skills and disciplined approach to work contributed to the rebuilding of infrastructure and the revitalization of industries disrupted by the war. In some cases, their expertise introduced new methods and innovations that had long-term benefits for British industry. The economic integration of prisoners was facilitated by a wage system that provided them with modest compensation for their labor. While the amounts were small by civilian standards, these wages allowed prisoners to purchase goods from camp canteens and, as restrictions eased, from local shops. This system not only provided prisoners with a sense of normalcy and autonomy, but also stimulated local economies. Shopkeepers and businesses in areas with prisoner camps noted significant increases in sales as prisoners became active consumers. They purchased cigarettes, toiletries, clothing, and small luxury items that made their confinement more bearable. This spending power, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, represented a substantial injection of purchasing power into local economies. The presence of German prisoners also had ripple effects on local communities. As they worked alongside British citizens, relationships formed that led to mutual exchanges of skills and knowledge. This collaboration fostered innovation and efficiency improvements that benefited everyone involved. The prisoners' integration demonstrated that former enemies could become valuable contributors to British society when given the opportunity. However, the integration of German prisoners was not without significant challenges and resistance. Public opposition was particularly pronounced among veterans groups and families who had lost loved ones during the war. For many Britons, the sight of German soldiers working freely in their communities was a painful reminder of recent losses and a source of considerable resentment. The British Legion and other veterans organisations organised protests and petitions calling for stricter controls on prisoner movements and questioning the government's policies on integration. They argued that such lenient treatment was inappropriate, given the atrocities committed during the war, and disrespectful to those who had sacrificed their lives in the fight against Nazi Germany. Media coverage often amplified these concerns, with newspapers and radio programs featuring heated debates about the soft treatment of German prisoners. Sensational stories of fraternization, alleged preferential treatment, and security breaches fueled public controversy. Editorial writers questioned whether such policies were wise or appropriate, given the fresh memories of war and the ongoing process of denazification. Security concerns represented another significant challenge. There were legitimate fears that allowing prisoners greater freedoms could lead to escape attempts or even acts of sabotage. While the vast majority of prisoners showed no inclination to escape and adhered strictly to the rules governing their movement, isolated incidents did occur and were often magnified in the public consciousness. The case of Heinrich Weber illustrates both the challenges and the ultimate success of the integration program. Weber, a former SS officer, initially resisted the re-education efforts and maintained his allegiance to Nazi ideology. His presence in a work detail near Manchester caused considerable concern among local authorities and community members who were aware of his background. However, over months of working alongside British civilians and experiencing democratic society firsthand, Weber's attitudes began to change. The kindness shown by his British supervisor, the fairness of his treatment, and the obvious prosperity and freedom of British society gradually undermined his ideological convictions. By 1948, Weber had become one of the most cooperative prisoners in his camp and eventually chose to remain in Britain as a civilian worker. The British government faced the delicate task of balancing legitimate security concerns with the practical benefits of prisoner integration. Enhanced security measures were implemented, including regular roll calls, monitoring of work assignments, and careful screening of prisoners selected for greater freedoms. Efforts were also made to engage with the public, providing information about the economic necessity of the program and the safeguards in place to ensure security. Despite the challenges and occasional setbacks, the overall success of the integration program became increasingly evident. Escape rates remained remarkably low, instances of serious misconduct were minimal, and the economic benefits were undeniable. Over time, as communities witnessed the positive contributions of prisoners and personal relationships developed, resistance began to diminish, paving the way for even greater integration. As the post-war years progressed and the process of repatriation began, many German prisoners faced a profound and difficult choice. They could return to a homeland devastated by war, where cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and the political future remained uncertain. Alternatively, they could remain in Britain, where they had begun to rebuild their lives, formed relationships, and found opportunities for a stable future. Germany in 1947 presented a bleak prospect for returning prisoners. Major cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were landscapes of rubble and destruction. The economy was in shambles, unemployment was rampant, and basic necessities were scarce. The country was divided among the Allied powers, its political future uncertain, and the process of denazification created additional complications for returning soldiers. For many prisoners, the contrast with their experience in Britain was stark. They had found steady work, fair treatment, and the possibility of building new lives. Some had formed deep friendships with British families, others had married British women, and many had simply grown accustomed to a way of life that offered stability and opportunity. Recognizing these realities, the British government offered an unprecedented alternative. German prisoners who wished to remain in the United Kingdom could do so as civilian workers, transitioning from prisoner status to that of foreign nationals with work permit. This policy represented both a humanitarian gesture and a practical solution to ongoing labor shortages in various sectors. The response was remarkable. Approximately 25,000 German prisoners chose to remain in Britain rather than return to Germany. This decision represented a massive vote of confidence in British society and a testament to the success of the integration program. These men were choosing to make their futures in a country that had recently been their enemy, demonstrating the transformative power of fair treatment and human dignity. The transition from prisoner to civilian worker was not without challenges. Former prisoners had to navigate complex bureaucratic processes, secure permanent employment, and adapt to life without the structure and security of camp life. Many faced ongoing prejudice and suspicion from segments of British society that remained hostile to their presence. However, the majority of those who chose to stay successfully integrated into British society. They found employment in agriculture, industry, and various trades, often in the same communities where they had worked as prisoners. Many eventually pursued British citizenship, fully committing to their adopted homeland and contributing to its continued prosperity. The decision to remain in Britain often came at considerable personal cost. Many prisoners who stayed lost contact with families in Germany, unable to afford return visits or bring relatives to Britain. They faced the challenge of building new identities while preserving connections to their cultural heritage. Some struggled with guilt about abandoning their homeland during its time of greatest need, yet for most, the decision proved beneficial. They found opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible in post-war Germany. They raised families in safety and prosperity, contributed their skills to British industry and agriculture, and became valued members of their communities. Their success stories became powerful testimonies to the possibility of redemption and the benefits of treating former enemies with dignity and fairness. The long-term impact of the German prisoner integration program extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. The relationships formed, the lessons learned, and the precedents established during this unique chapter in British history had lasting effects on Anglo-German relations and provided valuable insights into post-conflict reconciliation. Many of the prisoners who remained in Britain became informal ambassadors for British values and democracy. When they eventually re-established contact with family and friends in Germany, they carried with them first-hand knowledge of democratic institutions, individual rights, and the rule of law. Their experiences provided powerful counter-narratives to Nazi propaganda and contributed to the broader process of German democratization. The communities that hosted German prisoners also benefited from the experience. Local residents learned valuable lessons about the humanity of former enemies and the possibility of reconciliation. These lessons proved particularly important as Britain navigated the complexities of the Cold War and the need to rebuild relationships with West Germany as an ally against Soviet expansion. The success of the program influenced British approaches to subsequent conflicts and prisoner management. The principles of fair treatment, productive employment, and gradual integration became models for handling prisoners in later conflict. The recognition that treating former enemies with dignity could serve both humanitarian and strategic purposes became an important element of British military and diplomatic doctrine. Academic studies of the program have provided insights into the psychology of reconciliation and the factors that promote successful post-conflict integration. Researchers have identified key elements including meaningful work, fair treatment, cultural exchange, and personal relationships as crucial components of successful prisoner rehabilitation and social integration. The marriages between German prisoners and British women created lasting bonds between the two nations. The children of these unions grew up as living symbols of reconciliation, carrying both German and British heritage and serving as bridges between the two cultures. Many of these families maintained connections to both countries, facilitating ongoing cultural and economic exchanges. Local communities across Britain still carry memories of their German residents. Village histories record the contributions of former prisoners who stayed to become farmers, craftsmen, and business owners. Churches maintain records of German prisoners who joined their congregations and contributed to community life. These local memories preserve the human dimension of this remarkable period and serve as reminders of the transformative power of compassion and understanding. The economic contributions of the prisoners had lasting effects on British agriculture and industry. Techniques and innovations introduced by German workers were adopted and refined, contributing to long-term productivity improvement. The demonstration that foreign workers could be successfully integrated into British society helped pave the way for later immigration policies and multicultural approaches to national development. Perhaps most importantly, the program demonstrated that even the deepest animosities could be overcome through patient effort, fair treatment, and recognition of shared humanity. The transformation of German prisoners from hated enemies to valued community members showed that reconciliation was possible even in the aftermath of total war. As we return to Thompson's Bakery in Little Wickham, now several years after that first tentative encounter between Margaret Thompson and Hans Müller, we find a scene that would have been unimaginable in 1945. Hans enters the shop with the easy familiarity of a regular customer, greeting Margaret warmly and inquiring about her health. Other customers nod acknowledgement, and young Tommy Fletcher, now a teenager, practices his German phrases with obvious pride. Hans has become more than just a customer. He is a friend and valued member of the community. He has married a local woman, found steady employment on a nearby farm, and is in the process of applying for British citizenship. His transformation from enemy prisoner to community member represents the success of a remarkable social experiment that challenged assumptions and changed lives. Margaret Thompson, now in her 60s, reflects on the journey that brought them to this point. The anger and grief that once consumed her have not disappeared, but they have been tempered by understanding and acceptance. She has learned that healing does not require forgetting, but it does demand the courage to see former enemies as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The story of German prisoners in Britain represents one of history's most successful examples of post-conflict reconciliation. It demonstrates that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground when treated with fairness and respect. The program's success lay not in grand gestures or political declarations, but in countless small acts of human decency performed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The bell above the bakery door continues to chime, welcoming customers of all backgrounds and nationalities. In that simple sound lies a profound truth that the bonds of community and humanity are stronger than the divisions of war and politics. The German prisoners who found new lives in Britain and the British citizens who welcomed them proved that reconciliation is not only possible but essential for building a better future. Their story reminds us that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when former enemies choose to see each other as human beings. In a world still torn by conflict and division, the lessons learned in British villages and farms during those remarkable post-war years remain as relevant and inspiring as ever. The transformation of German prisoners from enemies to neighbors, from outcasts to citizens, stands as a testament to the enduring power of human dignity and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest of times. If you found this incredible story of reconciliation and human dignity as fascinating as we did, please give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who appreciate these remarkable chapters of history. Your likes tell us that you value these deep dives into the untold stories that shaped our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did this story change your perspective on post-war reconciliation? Do you have family stories from this period, or know of similar examples of former enemies finding common ground? Your insights and personal connections to history make our community richer and more meaningful. If you're not already subscribed to our channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. We're dedicated to bringing you these carefully researched, compelling stories that reveal the extraordinary humanity behind historical events. From forgotten heroes to remarkable social experiments like this one, we explore the moments that prove human nature's capacity for growth, forgiveness, and transformation. Your subscription helps us continue investing in the deep research and thoughtful storytelling that brings these important stories to light. Together, we're preserving and sharing the lessons of history that remain powerfully relevant today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.